The United States will remember this day in which it was singled out for attack in the General Assembly for the very act of exercising our right as a sovereign nation. We will remember it when we are called upon to once again make the world's largest contribution to the United Nations.
President Trump is hitting the United Nations right where it hurts, in the wallet. The U.S. is taking almost $300 million away from its annual donation to the world body, which last week condemned the administration's decision to move the American embassy in Israel. Correspondent David Lee Miller has details tonight from New York.
The United Nations has agreed to a budget cutback following negotiations with the U.S. President Trump, a UN critic, has repeatedly said the World Organization is mismanaged.
While the United Nations on a regular budget has increased by 140% and its staff has more than doubled since 2000, we are not seeing the results in line with this investment.
U.S. UN Ambassador Nikki Haley says the UN core budget of $5.4 billion will be reduced by $285 million, about 5%. No specifics on how the money in the new budget would be saved, but a statement from the U.S. UN mission said, quote, "In addition to these significant cost savings, we reduced the UN's bloated management and support functions, bolstered support for key U.S. priorities throughout the world, and instilled more discipline and accountability throughout the UN system." The U.S. is by far the largest contributor to the UN budget, paying 22%, $610 million this year. That's more than double the next largest contributor, Japan, followed by China, Germany, and France. 31 of the poorest member states pay 1/100%, about $28,000 a year. The budget-cutting announcement follows a vote in the UN General Assembly rejecting President Trump's decision to recognize Jerusalem as Israel's capital. Ambassador Haley underscored the lopsided contributions following the UN General Assembly vote against the U.S.
When we make generous contributions to the UN, we also have a legitimate expectation that our goodwill is recognized and respected. When a nation is singled out for attack in this organization, that nation is disrespected. What's more, that nation is asked to pay for the privilege of being disrespected.
The latest United Nations budget reduction follows another UN budget cut that was urged by the U.S. The UN peacekeeping mission, which has separate funding, slashed its $8 billion budget by $600 million. Washington still picks up the largest portion of the peacekeeping tab of $2 billion a year.
The U.S. government has decided to slash its contribution to the United Nations budget for the coming year. Ambassador Nikki Haley gave a statement explaining the move.
When we make generous contributions to the UN, we also have a legitimate expectation that our goodwill is recognized and respected. The United States will remember this day in which it was singled out for attack in the General Assembly for the very act of exercising our right as a sovereign nation. We will remember it when we are called upon to once again make the world's largest contribution to the United Nations.
Nikki Haley went on to accuse the United Nations of inefficiency and overspending. Washington's contribution will be reduced by $285 million over the next fiscal year. Well, we're going to cross live now to political scientist Kaveh Afrasiabi, author of UN Management Reform. Thanks for coming onto the program, Kaveh. Let's start with the UN vote, 128-9 against Trump's decision on Jerusalem. In your opinion, do you think this is a direct retaliation from Washington?
Well, based on the statement read by Ambassador Haley, there is no doubt that there is a direct connection between that vote, which was a total embarrassment to the United States, and the retaliation that has followed in the form of a big financial stab at the UN, regretted by all the UN high officials, some of whom I've spoken to. And there was a fear that this could be twice as bad, and on the bright side, it's not even close to what candidate Trump promised in terms of a 50% slash in the U.S.'s contribution to the UN. Nevertheless, I suppose the White House's perverse Christmas gift to the world community and the premier world organization that saves millions of lives and is responsible for global peace and security, and definitely a big step in the wrong direction, contrary to what Ambassador Haley said.
Yeah, I mean, the explanation that she's given is that it's down to inefficiency and overspending of the United Nations, which she says is a well-known fact. And she goes on to say, we will no longer let the generosity of the American people be taken advantage of or remain unchecked. How right is she about the accusations of inefficiency and overspending?
Well, you know, the UN has been grappling with the issue of reform, and I've written extensively about that for a long time. But this is the wrong way of approaching the problem and connecting it to a particular vote at the UN General Assembly and so forth. I think just about everything that Ambassador Haley has done since assuming her post has been contrary to the spirit of the UN Charter, has been quite undiplomatic, foreign to the very notion of world diplomacy, complete tactfulness, and without any sense of nuance. So this kind of crude language of threat and punishment used against sovereign nations and so forth, this really hurts the US's image and credibility worldwide, and the United States is not helping itself by having someone represented at the United Nations who is so undiplomatic and foreign to the spirit of the United Nations.
Yeah. Some would say that it's been a tit-for-tat kind of reaction. Now, if we look at the US and their payments to the UN in the past, in 2015, for example, the US owed $2 billion for peacekeeping efforts, according to the UN Budget Office, that is. Do you think Washington is exaggerating its so-called generosity to the UN if we look at that one figure?
Absolutely. I mean, if you look at the UN's contribution to the city of New York itself, it far outweighs what the US gives to the UN. And the US, takes a lot more from the UN than the other way around. And a lot of people tend to ignore that. I doubt very much that Mr. Trump himself would be the US president if the UN headquarters was not in this city. But the fact of the matter is that you have an administration that uses what the philosopher Jürgen Habermas refers to as instrumentalist rationality, that is simply an archaic 19th century method of dealing with world diplomacy. This arcane approach is bound to have negative repercussions on world peace and security, and if you take money from the UN and starve it financially, that means that the UN will be able to do a lot less in terms of refugees, population management, sustainable development, conflict prevention, peace building, peacekeeping, and so on and so forth. And unfortunately, Ambassador Haley is just the wrong person, at the wrong time, and is doing whatever it can to continue this Trump's war on the United Nations.
Kaveh, I mean, you've just listed all the things that the UN is supposed to do and does, but isn't that Haley's point, is the fact that she's saying that the US people have been taken advantage of because of the contribution to the UN?
No, because the very purpose of contributing to the United Nations is not to, use it as a self-platform to bully and threaten other nations and to extract unidirectional benefits from it, but rather to engage in global diplomacy for the resolution of global conflicts and issues such as the problems of sustainable development and so on. And for Ambassador Haley to claim that there's got to be a monetary value on these kinds of reciprocal services is just misreading the very notion, intention, and purpose of the United Nations and membership in it. And unfortunately, the very ABC of UN culture of peace and reciprocity, tolerance, and dialogue is missing in the mindset and worldview of Nikki Haley.
Okay, well, we could discuss this for ages, but we've run out of time. Kaveh Afrasiabi, political scientist and author of UN Management Reform. Thanks very much for coming onto the program.
Well, joining us now, former U.S. Ambassador to the UN, now Senior Fellow at the American Enterprise Institute, and a Fox News contributor, Ambassador John Bolton. Ambassador, good morning.
Glad to be with you.
I'm so glad that you're here to talk about this. We should say that you've got a great op-ed in today's Wall Street Journal. It's titled, How to Defund the UN. So I encourage everybody to read it. It's a great piece. But when it comes to the budget, what do you make of these moves? And also, you know better than we do the machinations of the UN. How is this going to be perceived within the walls of the UN?
Well, I think the defunding certainly is a move in the right direction. Exactly what it does and how it worked out is hard to say, and precisely what the financial effect will be. What happened Christmas Eve night about 10 o'clock was that the UN General Assembly finally got around to adopting the budget for 2018-2019, but that process had been in train for a long time, and the cuts were basically baked in. It would be a mistake to think that the budget was reduced as a consequence of the Jerusalem votes. I think what Ambassador Haley was presaging, though, in terms of the future, is the direction the Trump administration is going to go in. That's why I wrote the piece in the Wall Street Journal today to help provide a little roadmap if that's the way they want to go.
Okay, so she's looking basic for ROI, return on investment. That's what the United States wants. We know we cover 22% of their budget. Do you see further cuts coming? It sounds like you do.
Well, absolutely. I mean, I think we need to reject the entire taxation system on which the UN budget for most agencies is based. They develop a top-line number for the budget, and then we get to pay 22% of it, as you said, 28% in the case of UN peacekeeping. So when we're unable to affect the top-line budget, we are taxed at the rate of 22%. I think we should reject assessed contributions. I think we should simply make voluntary contributions based on the revolutionary principle that we should only pay for what we want and we should expect to get what we paid for. I think that would be a tsunami through the UN system.
So give us some ideas about what we would pay for, because so many activities of the UN are not in the best interests of the United States, and we have dissented on those areas again and again. What parts of UN activities should America voluntarily support?
Well, I think there's some specialized agencies that are not part of this UN budget we've been talking about, have their own separate budgets, but they are specialized agencies that do important work. The Food and Agricultural Organization, the International Atomic Energy Agency, the International Civil Aviation Organization. A lot of them people have never heard of because they just do their job. They're not political. They can all see budget trimming like any government or intergovernmental agency. Those are the ones we should support. But others that, like the UN Human Rights Council, for example, I would not only defund that, I would withdraw the United States from it and delegitimize it.
That's interesting. You know, well, obviously the budget cut comes days after the UN overwhelmingly adopted that resolution that denounced the president's decision to move the U.S. Embassy in Israel to Jerusalem. But you also had Guatemala over the weekend. They say that they're going to move their embassy to Jerusalem as well. That's the first nation to follow our lead. Now you've got 10 other countries reportedly in talks with Israel to move their embassies. So, Ambassador, do you think that these other countries, that there's going to be more countries that will follow suit, follow our lead, if you will?
Well, I think it's entirely possible, but let's be clear. I think the president still has an uphill battle with the State Department. What he announced was that we recognize that Jerusalem was, in fact, Israel's capital. But the State Department within days said, well, we're not going to change that on maps for passports that are issued to U.S. citizens who were born in Jerusalem, for example. It's not going to say Jerusalem, Israel. A whole series of things like that that lead me to believe the State Department still doesn't want to move the embassy. So president's a real estate executive. He knows how to get things done. He needs to push that along. And I think once we start turning dirt on a new embassy site, other countries will follow because it's common sense. Where do you normally put your country's embassy? You put it in the capital of the country to which the diplomats are accredited. That's all the president really did.
Ambassador Steve Rogers, good seeing you again. Ambassador, there's been an ongoing debate, which I'm sure you're aware of, as to whether the UN should move its headquarters out of the United States and plant themselves somewhere else on the face of this earth. What's your take on this?
No, I think we should keep the UN headquarters in New York. Think of all these foreign dignitaries and their spouses who come to New York and spend money, boost our economy, increase the tax base. I wouldn't give it to Geneva or some other UN city and let them get the benefit out of it. As long as they're here, let's keep them here.
Let's hope they pay their parking fines in the city.
I know.
Well, I'd go with that. Yes, I would go with that.
That's a good point. But they should pay their tickets. That's a good point. Ambassador, but let me ask you this. I mean, there's been so much disruption around the world, whether it's with Russia or China or North Korea, this instability in the Middle East. But do you think that the UN, many now question the value of the UN in a serious fashion. And Haley's saying, look, we're spending too much. But some say that the UN just has lost its effectiveness as a body. What do you say to that?
Well, I think there's a lot to that. The spending is a problem in and of itself, but the spending is also a reflection, it's a symptom of the underlying issue, which is that these bureaucracies have a tendency to grow and assume responsibilities in ways that try and affect democratic governments. That's why, for example, I'd pull out of the Human Rights Council, which has demonstrated a consistently anti-Israel, anti-American policy, this council and its predecessor. And I think it goes to a point President Trump has made that certainly I've been concerned about for a long time. That's protecting American sovereignty. I think when the United States uses its financial clout in the UN, it can be heard. And when we don't, by and large, we're ignored.
Ambassador John Bolton, it was good to have you on the show. We appreciate your time.
Glad to be with you.
Yeah, and the great op-ed in the Journal.